hip hop culture and hip hop music was the first space that I saw that decentered that normative gaze and instead offered a reclamation of communal agency. And you see this right now with like the Kendrick Lamar versus Drake beat,
Yes.
which is all about, you know, do we want artists who are here to lead us into the mainstream, or do we want artists who are here to wrest control of a narrative from a mainstream onto a margin or onto the voices of a community? So coming into contact with that kind of ethos when I was, you know, a Chinese kid in Delaware, in these suburbs, without a lot of other people around me that understood or could articulate the experiences I was having, hip hop really gave me an angle on something that led me to my ethnoracial awakening. And, you know, hip hop has this slogan: it's not where you're from, it's where you're at. And there has
Oh yeah.
I've been traveling for the last like 3 months. Yeah, and it's very hot.
Oh my gosh. Well, I don't want to stress you out for this interview. Are you in LA right now?
Yeah, I just got back on Saturday.
Dang. How are you like taking care of yourself and balancing? Is there such a thing as balance right now?
Yeah, there is. It comes when I say no to everything. Yeah, that's the only time I really get peace.
Oh my gosh. Well, I appreciate you for contributing your time today. I one of my favorite songs that you wrote was, I forget his name, but it was like a Filipino artist that you collaborated with, and you were talking about the Mexican collaboration with the Filipinos. Do you know which song I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Yeah, and then
yeah, probably with AJ.
yeah, it was with AJ. That's right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
Delaware was also a really good song that you wrote. Like I had no idea
Oh
that
wow.
I had no idea that you grew up in Delaware until I started doing research on you. And so I kind of wanted to start there of like, how did music play a role in your healing and in your understanding of culture when you were growing up in Delaware?
Yeah. Let's see. Do you want to do a header or do you want to just jump in like this?
Let's just jump in. That's my style. I just kind of just start talking,
Awesome.
you know?
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always say that music taught me specifically, and I'll be very specific actually, because it wasn't music, it was hip hop. Hip hop music and hip hop culture. Because music in and of itself can be harmful, right? It's all the role that it's allowed to play and what you envision your relationship to art and to creativity being. So for me, it was hip hop music that was the first place that I glimpsed a recentering of narrative agency onto the margins.
Wow.
You know, because everything that I'd seen up to that point, it was very much in alignment with hierarchical power structures that we see every day and we're used to. You know, when music is pop music, which is nearly always white, cis, heterosexual, wealthy coded. And when it's not, it's still coded for that gaze often.
Wow.
Right? So it can be pop music, it can be classical music, right, which obviously has its own sort of elitisms. But hip hop culture and hip hop music was the first space that I saw that decentered that normative gaze and instead offered a reclamation of communal agency. And you see this right now with like the Kendrick Lamar versus Drake beat,
Yes.
which is all about, you know, do we want artists who are here to lead us into the mainstream, or do we want artists who are here to wrest control of a narrative from a mainstream onto a margin or onto the voices of a community? So coming into contact with that kind of ethos when I was, you know, a Chinese kid in Delaware, in these suburbs, without a lot of other people around me that understood or could articulate the experiences I was having.
Mm,
Hip hop really gave me an angle on something that led me to my ethnoracial awakening.
that's so good. I can relate in a lot of ways because that's how I felt when my mom would let me watch Filipino television while we were watching.
Yeah.
While all my friends would watch Lizzie McGuire, I would see examples of people that looked exactly like me living my life experience. But what was missing in that narrative was the racial divide that I experienced even living in Los Angeles. And even as a Filipino kid, the Philippines like ships so many people to Los Angeles because of the nursing shortage that historically happened in the
Hmm.
1980s and the AIDS crisis. But I'm curious about like I can only imagine that as a Chinese kid in Delaware, you were probably one of the few kids with your cultural background. And so, and on top of that, being interested in hip hop, it's historically African American, right? And so,
Hmm.
how did you start to understand where you fit into the world of hip hop and the music that you started to create as a byproduct of feeling seen from that medium?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, I certainly, hip hop is black. I also
Yeah.
want to name that it's, Latinx and Central
Yes.
American. Puerto Ricans, Dominicans had a huge, huge, huge role to play in the environment in the 70s as hip hop was being founded. Um,
Mm,
and this is the thing, right? So I'm in my 30s. I grew up very much in sort of like this multicultural neoliberalism
hmm
that flourished in, white dominated and ostensibly diverse suburban spaces in the 90s and the 80s. And so that's certainly part of my outlook on this question. But another thing is that I would say I grew up in a time when communal belonging was at once less fraught and also more, I think, multipolar than it's become. Um, because in that sort of neoliberal multicultural 90s, um, very much post-racialism was proffered as aspirational,
mm,
even though many knew that that wasn't real. But,
yeah.
things like, you know, white kids, MTV, right? MTV playing rap
Yeah.
videos was not seen as culture vulturing,
Yeah.
which it is, but it was seen as platforming, which it also is,
Mm,
right? And I think that one of the issues is that we've overcompensated in what I think is generally a healthy direction. And now there's this suspicion of people presumed to be outsiders, whether that's by gender identity, whether that's by uh, you know, income level, whether that's by racialization. There is a healthy suspicion of outsiders. Um,
mm,
but what I think that undercuts is the possibility of multipolar solidarity and hybridity. Um,
mm,
you look at the fecundity of work that has sprung up because of intercultural exchange or interracial exchange even.
yeah.
And I think that growing up in that time, the question was not, like I said, in some ways it was more uh fraught
Mm,
because, you know, there wasn't an 88 Rising. There wasn't uh, a Lisa from Blackpink. There wasn't, you know, a lot of these touchstones
mm,
that we now have come to normalize.
mm,
But what there was always a sense of if you could show up and be authentic in the culture, um, people would welcome you, and especially in hip hop,
yeah.
which is a space that's all about hybridity, sampling, connecting. And hip hop has this slogan: "It's not where you're from, it's where you're at."
Mm,
And there has always been this idea in hip hop that as long as you come and you participate, and you're not just here to take, but you're also here to genuinely participate in a creative community,
Mm,
you belong. And so for me, that was what I found when I dove into hip hop. Was, there were always older older folks at the table who were willing to welcome me in, as long as I made it clear with my actions that I was, not here to be a cultural tourist, but here to learn and to give.
that's so good. Part of the reason why I'm saying that this is really good is that I think that there's similar to the way that you're referencing the history of hip hop and the cultural references and the hybridity that came with it. I think it's also reflective of your music, because when I started listening to your music, you know, you had a sentiment of so much of pop music is inherently, in my words, like lifeless and only driven by lust. But when I listen to your music, it's so personal and it's so heart driven. Like the reason why I brought up Delaware in the beginning of our interview was because I felt your childhood. You know, you talk about I think it the line was like wet dry, was it wet summers and dry heat? I forget the line, I'm
Yeah,
butchering it,
yeah.
but I was like, "Oh, I could feel what it was like to grow up in that town." Like 99% of people went to UD, and I was listening to it and I was like, "Oh, I'm understanding what it was like to live in his experience." And so when you're crafting music, I often notice too, this is a two-part question. You have a lot of collaborations with
Hmm.
people. And so when you're writing music, is it intentional? Like did you go about writing hip hop from a place of collaborative like networking, or was it driven out of let me tell stories of other people? Was it an and or was it an or?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mhm.
I would say, uh, I collaborate when it makes sense.
Okay.
Obviously when we're in the studio, I love collaborative energy. I love having other voices at the table that I can learn from, that I can see their perspectives. Just from a songwriting perspective, it always, the more ears in the room, the more pens in the room, the more likelihood that something amazing is going to come out.
Mm,
Um, so from a pure technical aesthetic sense, I love collaboration.
mm,
Um, We'll say, for example, that song Delaware.
yeah.
We started putting together that beat, we started putting together that record, and once we had it at a certain stage, I reached out to my boy Shane that I grew up with.
Mm,
So Shane
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Palkovitz, he's a really dope folk artist. We've known each other since we were like 10. And he and his partner, they bought a barn back in Delaware and they're renovating it into a studio and a performance space, this like 300-year-old barn.
Wow.
So he's a dear, dear friend of mine. And in this case, we started that record, and it was like, yo, I think that this would make so much sense to bring to him
Mhm.
and say, hey, do you like this concept? What would you do on this here?
Mm,
And so it has to be organic, I think. It has to, like you said, you mentioned, and I very much appreciate that, I do want my music to have a lot of soul.
yeah.
I think I'm not the greatest pop writer or performer. I do think that the stuff I have is very, very grounded and gutsy, and it's soft.
Mhm.
It's not glossy. It's very soft stuff. And because of the stuff that I want to put out and the impact that I want my work to have, it does have to be, obviously we do it smart, we write it well, we do, make the production slap, but it is more important to me to
Mhm.
have something that feels organic and has life in it, rather than something that is just the kind of product that like a VC would optimize for,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily scale, and that's a feature, not a bug to me.
I like that. Jason, I just want to acknowledge the way that you view music is so communal. Um, and it's so collaborative. Even like I was listening to a lot of your music before this, that's why it's so fresh in my mind. Like even the new single that you just came out with, Burner, like it's not
Uh,
just a normal love song. It's like you told me that I meant a lot to you. And then I it made me think. I was like, okay, what does this mean? Burner, burner phone, burner contact. It's very poetic in a lot of ways. And so I like, what goes into the writing of a song? Is it the words first? Is it laying down the beat? Is it a concept where you're talking to someone in the studio? How does it come about?
yeah, honestly, there's a lot of different on ramps
Okay.
to that production process. And it really, so in the case of Burner, a little over a year ago, a year and a half ago at this point, I met this really dope, Lao American artist,
Mm,
Soul. We were in Dallas. I was hosting, an event and he was on the lineup and he just killed it. Like incredible writer, performer. And it was like, yo, we're both in SoCal. When we get back, let's get together. So we got together. We're sitting in the studio and in that case, we didn't have nothing in mind in particular. I just knew he's a really great writer and performer.
mm,
He appreciated what I did. So we sat there with my producer and engineer, this dude, Johnum, um, and then also our boy Kenny. And they just played us some stuff. And one of the beats they played us was this burner beat that,
mm.
we just started playing around with melodies. So in that case, it was very much music forward. It
Yeah.
was very much, yo, let's play some stuff, see what inspires us, and then enjoy that. Enjoy the process of it was a very aesthetically driven process
Mm,
where it was just like, yo, I like this beat. It makes us feel something. Okay, what does it make us feel? Oh, we're a little sad. Like, this is like a love, but like a breakup maybe, or
mm,
these emotions. So then going through that, crafting it. Soul is such an incredible pop writer
mm.
that soon as we came up with those feelings, he started putting the tune to it, and then yeah, it came about very naturally. And this is something that to go to this podcast and the content y'all do.
Yeah.
I think that this is where the arts can really, really help folks get in touch with themselves, right? So much of therapy
Yeah.
is just understanding what you're actually feeling,
Mm,
understanding where it comes from, learning how to vocalize that. And I think one of the greatest things about creativity is that if you really dive deep into your creative process, that's something you start doing. When I sit in the studio these days, it's like, yo, how am I feeling?
mm,
What energy do I want? Okay, now if I'm writing lyrics, how do I express that energy? Right?
mm,
Where's it coming from? Is it coming from a conversation I had with my girlfriend? Is it coming from this person who cut me off in traffic? Is it coming from, you know, feelings of fear or feelings of confidence?
mm.
Both at the same time. Um, to me, there's a way of looking at the creative process, which is therapy in action,
Yeah.
you know, um,
Yeah.
which is mental. I wouldn't even say mental wellness because certainly not everybody who's creative is mentally
That
well,
word is
but
debatable. The word wellness. What
yeah,
does it mean
right.
to be well? Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, but it's certainly like self-awareness or awareness is very important in the creative process.
I like
And
that.
yeah, so that's
Yeah, I speaking to that when it comes to music and therapy and process, music is
mm,
so personal because it when you think about it, as opposed to any creative medium, you have to have it be biographical or some sort of autobiographical experience for people to feel what you're writing and what you're laying down on the track. It's very different
mhm.
from film because films take 2 years to produce and then you have to have the eyes and ears of so many different people. And so like I'm curious about like when you're writing music, how open do you have to be? Because even doing this podcast, like there has to be some level of self-disclosure for it to be a good conversation, right? And so in the same way with music, like do you make it an intention to have practices when you're going into things? Like mental state, emotional state, judgments.
Yeah. I I mean, this goes back to how we opened the conversation, is self-care, right? Is
Mm,
looking after
your
yourself.
no.
And I think, yeah, and I think that is something that as I get older and as I keep touring and traveling more and doing more work, all last week I was on the road. I was literally every day was traveling or performing. And then I got home and I had some great events this weekend.
Yeah.
But yeah, the older I get and the more I have weeks like that and weekends like that, the more that I've learned to articulate to myself when I'm very rested, when I am sort of like in the middle of it,
Mm,
or when I'm like running near E and it's time to rest. So I was talking to my manager this morning and telling her like, hey, it's probably I'm gonna hide behind you a lot this week.
mm,
This week, if stuff comes in, because then I woke up this morning and there were like three or four people in my inbox asking for that, and these are people I like. These
yes.
are people I like. These are people I want to help and support. Um, and there was a time in my life where I would have done that and then gotten to a pretty bad place for myself and then had to dig myself out of that. Versus now I'm
Mm,
learning to be a little more proactive, and this is something that I've worked with my therapist about a lot, is identifying where I'm at, from full to empty.
yeah.
Where am I at? And instead of running it down to empty every 4 to 6 months, every 3 to 4 months, and then recharging all the way back up, how do I get to like 40% and say, okay, let me go back up?
Mm,
Um, and all of that, for an artist, it's because, going into the studio or going on tour or creating content, that's our job. You know what I'm saying?
mm,
So I would say that all the same practices that, people take into the workplace with them, it's very similar. Everything you take into your relationship or your workplace, your family life, it's like that in the creative genres, in creative fields.
yeah. My boyfriend is a filmmaker. And so I know the collaborative process to an extent. I actually have been playing the guitar since I was 7, but I by no means perform professionally. And so when I watch him navigate, like creating a gear list, collaborating, there comes a point where I start to notice that his battery is also starting to empty. And then the love
Mm.
of the art starts to wane a little bit. And then it never leads to second guessing for his story. But I'm curious about, you've been doing this for a long time. Has there ever been a time where you just wanted to take a pause on music, or you started to feel like you didn't want to do it anymore?
Yeah, I would say there's two times. One was, earlier in my career
Mm,
when I wasn't getting the traction that I hoped, or when I just wasn't
yeah.
it wasn't popping off yet. Um,
Mm,
there was all the time this question of me to myself of, is this worth it?
wow.
Is what I'm doing worth it? Is it worth it to be like in the midst of this in this way, or you know? Is this something that I was supposed to try and learn about myself and learn some things out of it, and then ultimately my impact lies elsewhere. Um, at that time when I felt those things, though, I there was always um, just enough wins that it was enough to keep me going.
Mm,
There was enough wins to affirm that the feeling of not being where I wanted to be was not an absolute thing, but it was something that was tied to that moment in my career, right? The issue was not that I'm in the wrong place. The issue is that I'm waiting to get to take the next step, you know? Um,
is it a question of patience, or is it perspective? Because when you're talking about, it wasn't that I was in the wrong place, it was that I was waiting to take the next step. For people
mm,
listening who are in it, because we do have a lot of creatives listen to this podcast. what is that difference? Like how can you tell whether or not you're in the wrong place or you're just waiting for that next step?
Yeah, so I talk. I was just leading a storytelling cohort at the Japanese American National
Oh, that's
Museum
so cool.
for their civic season
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
programming.
Hmm.
So I was talking with this cohort of 12 Angelinos,
Yeah.
diverse racial and gender identity and age, generation backgrounds.
Hmm.
I was talking to them about performance, storytelling, and the difference. You are always going to feel discomfort.
Mm.
You're just always in life. In life, we're always going to feel discomfort.
Hmm.
The question is, though, there's discomfort that comes because we're doing the wrong thing and we're harming ourselves and others.
Mm.
And there's discomfort because we're doing something new and we're unused to that space. And knowing the difference between unease that comes because of harm versus unease that comes because of growth is, I think, maybe that's one of the top three skills that you need in life. Thus far, in my late 30s, that I would say is one of the top three things that helps you figure out where you're going. Because if you don't know how to tell, and I'll be real, for a long time, I didn't, there's that boundary, uh, of, again, like running till empty,
Mm.
of going too long, of maybe 2 days ago I should have started slowing down on events instead of waiting till now. Um, but I would say that I told these students, and I have been telling a lot of friends, like that's the key difference here is, because we're in mental health, we're in, the mental health space. We know that there are people who are oversharers.
Yeah,
There are people who share to avoid confronting. There are people who share to avoid growing.
that's good.
There are people who share for catharsis. And I see this all the goddamn time in music, at open mics and at performances. Artists, musicians who think that by writing a song about something, they've healed through it, when in reality, all they've done is had the catharsis of speaking on it, but they haven't changed anything about their circumstances. They haven't
Mm.
changed anything about their protocols. They haven't changed anything about their infrastructure. They haven't changed anything about their positionality.
Hmm.
And so I think that's why I say, like there's sometimes you have that release, but it actually doesn't create growth. It creates harm. It creates harm for
Wow.
your audience and yourself.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so I think being able to distinguish between those is huge, and I hope I can and keep getting better at that.
I noticed that about you. You're not an oversharer. And I'm glad that you brought it up, Jason. I think that, you brought up a really great subject of there are people that share for the wrong reasons. And, I've labeled it as the shadow side of creativity, that sometimes we can hide behind vulnerability, that we know how to be fake vulnerable. We know how to cry. We know the beats of a different story. And I think I was listening to the Armchair Expert podcast with Dak Shepard, and he was talking about how he never wants to talk about the recent relapse of day 7, like way back when, because he doesn't want it to be an act or a show. And so, like,
Hmm.
what are two questions for you? Because we were talking about running on empty, and we were also talking about being oversharers. Um, what are some signs that you know that you need to slow down? And question 2 for you is, how do you keep yourself from oversharing?
Yeah, let me see. How do I know I need to slow down? Um, I, I kind of keep a touch on my barometer. I mean, so back in the day,
Mm-hmm.
10 years ago, it was like I would get sick. I would push myself like every tour. I'd get a cold or something, and just exhaustion, and that's not okay.
I know that one. That's a good one.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So literally sometimes that's just your body telling you,
Mm-hmm.
and listen to your body. And then these days, what I've worked on with my therapist, what I've very much worked on with my therapist over the last like 2, 3 years was I we get locked into these narrative loops, right? We get knocked, and so okay, so if it's a narrative loop that ends with me angry and resentful and tired and physically sick,
Mm.
um, it's like, okay, what's the step before that? And it's usually me tired, feeling obligated, saying yes to things out of obligation, um, not saying, not reaching back out and saying, hey, no. Okay, now where does that come from? Okay, so before, and like extent, like we know what the last bit of this story is. Now, what's the chapter before and before and before and before?
Mm.
And then that's how we put together this rubric of like, okay, man, like it's not 100% the same all the time, but there's some real common steps in this story.
Mm.
So, instead of waiting till step 10 to say, oh, I'm ass out, can I, what's step 8 look like?
Mm.
What does step 5 look like? What does step 2 look like? And then depending on, maybe some really important stuff you got to get done. All right, I'll take it to an 8 then. I'll let it go to step 8. But then I know step 8, that last 20%, like that's where it goes from I'm tired, I'm not doing so great, but I'm not harming myself or my relationships.
Mm.
Versus when it gets to a 9 or 10, now I'm either harming myself or I'm harming people around me.
That's good.
So just learning to do that is what's helped me. Like literally in my mind, it's almost like this graph of like, where am I at? And a lot of days I don't even think about where I'm at. But then when it starts creeping towards just learning to identify the warning signs earlier and earlier and earlier,
Mm.
just as with anybody who has, we all got health complications. We all got mental health complications in 2024,
Yes.
right? So if you're diabetic, knowing, reading your glucose levels and being like, I'm good right now, but I should probably have a snack in like an hour, and exact, our mental health is just as dire and leads to, like, we know the research is out there. It leads to just as pronounced health outcomes, mortality disparities, uh, income outcomes are all tied to mental health, uh, actual, like there's markers of well-being. And so we've got to treat it serious just because, it does, it's not even like mental health is just in our minds. It does affect ourselves very physically.
Mm.
Um, yeah. So that's the first half of the question.
Love it. Second half of the question was, how do you keep yourself from oversharing in creativity? Because we all know Taylor Swift, not to knock on Taylor Swift, but that's one of the biggest criticisms about her songwriting. The most common like pop reference that I have, but go on.
Mhm. Yeah, I avoid oversharing because I have friends. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I
I
do. I
have
do know
friends that
that.
I actually talk to
Yes.
that know how I'm doing and ask me how I'm doing. I don't need a parasocial relationship to affirm that like my life has dignity and my choices have value. Because
Mm,
I have people
that's
that
good.
love me.
That's good.
Um, and and I mean, I will say when I was younger, like, yeah, you post, hey, happy anniversary.
Mm,
Oh man, I love this woman. Oh, hey everyone, I'm not feeling so good right now. Like, I'm wondering about this. And then, people love that. People love, they send it. Oh, hey, we feel you. My mentor in grad school, what he always says is there's a difference between disclosing and venting.
mm,
And what he says, is that disclosure is great. Disclosure can connect you with people that are listening to you. Disclosure can bring your lived experiences into your work and your research. When you choose to divulge something, it can be really useful for what you're trying to do. The difference between disclosure and venting is that disclosure, you're in charge. Disclosure, you are choosing, you have agency, you're choosing to do this thing because you think it'll be useful for what you're trying to do. Versus venting, you are not in control. Venting is, it's like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, a
Mm,
riot is the language of the unheard.
that's good.
Venting is the language of the unwell. And when you're not well and you have no release and you have no relief, then you just need to spew it out there. And that's when you get some really, some Instagram stories people wish they could take back, some emails, some Discord messages people wish they could take back.
Mm.
Um, and I'm a professional. I've been doing this thing for a while. I make my living doing this thing. Um, I'm not on Instagram because it's fun. I'm on Instagram because that's where I get to connect with people that I have something to say to. And, thank God, like they think that there's something that I say that has value.
That's so refreshing for
I'm
you to
on
say
there.
that. That's so refreshing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'll divulge when it's useful. Hey, February 14th, boom, we've all gone through some things. I'm in a happy partnership, but I want to call out and acknowledge that there's many out there who aren't. I've been there too. If you're there, yo, it's possible. Stay loved. Love doesn't just look like romance. Boom.
Mm.
Great. I just shared something about myself. I'll let you know I've got a partner. I'll let you know I've been where you've been. Um, Very different from like, hey, it's February 14th and man, I'm just thinking about all the times that I didn't have this and yo, it's amazing. Am I sharing for you or for me?
Mm.
Um, yeah.
That's good. Because we all know those people. I want to go back to something that you said where I think a lot of people would benefit from hearing this. I'm not on Instagram to talk about myself. I'm on Instagram because I want to connect with people. And that's such a great distinction. Where are you doing it? Who are you doing it for? Is it is it a narcissistic page where it's all about Jason, or is it a service to other people? And I think just that small cognitive shift can help us have boundaries when it comes to what we post and what we share on social media and how we get our art out there. Um, Jason, I want to be respectful of your time because I know we're 5 minutes away from 2:45, and I know that you've been traveling all week. So I'll end with this question: as a professional musician, as someone that's been doing this for a really long time, what is one mantra or one wisdom tip that you've gotten in your life that keeps you going in your career?
Interesting. It's something that keeps me going. That's it. I don't know. Maybe this is what I'll say. I don't think there's been one thing. It's changed in each era of my career.
Mm,
You know,
that's good.
um, there are through lines. There's a mission statement I've had, speaking hope and healing in a broken world. That has stayed consistent. But I wouldn't say that that drives me forward. I would say that centers me as I go forward.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, what I would say is actually there's plenty of slogans I have, trust me, but they kind of refresh every era of my life. There was moving to LA, brand new. No one knew me.
mm,
Never had nothing go viral. Never really toured. What I needed to get through that stage was, you know, I would say team not lazy. That was my squad. And then,
mm,
there was a point where it was less about like hustling hard and it was more about growing and doing better. And then, like what I would always say to my partner and to my creative director, I'd say we want to be beautiful and useful. Like anything we make,
mm,
we want it to be both of those. And then, now I'm even in another stage than that. And now I'm at a point where I'm doing a lot more content creation and a lot more of what I'm making. Um, I'm just saying like, yo, how can I translate information and experiences I have into a format that people can relate to and they can understand why this is useful for them. So, like it's all like I'm no longer team not lazy. Like I'm still working hard, but it's almost like I learned that lesson and internalized that mantra to the point where now I'm no longer consciously repeating it,
Wow.
but it's sort of like merged in and fused with my DNA. So if there's anything I'd say, it's that for me, life has been progressive in the sense of as I go from one stage to another, being grateful for the stages I've passed through, but also knowing when, oh, the lesson has changed, or I've changed, my positionality has changed, my role has changed. And, the same energy that I brought to the table as a 26-year-old upstart trying to break out in the field is different than the energy that I have in my late 30s as someone who's somewhat established, who's a known quantity, who has some relationships. And instead of just trying to recapture that feeling of, man, it was so good then, like, being grateful and living in this moment where I'm at right now.
Oof.
That's just, in my experience, how that's worked out for me.
Yeah, it's like a resonant feeling of acceptance, reflection, and satisfaction for where you are and what is, which is so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, and saying this is again something that I learned in therapy, like saying thank you to the past, appreciating certain habits or certain lifestyles or certain rhythms that got me to where I am, and then also saying it's I'm appreciative of what you've brought me, but it's also time to release you and move into another stage of being.
Oof. I am appreciative of what we have, but it's time to move into another stage. That, there's so many themes of progress. I can keep talking to you, Jason, but thank you so much. I feel like you can be a professor or something. Like you can
Hey, sometimes I do it.
you can give people a PhD in hip hop and music. That is this was such a great interview, and um thank you so much for your time. I want to respect it and let you go now, but I got so much value from this conversation, and I'm sure other people will too.
Sick. I'm glad. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Yellow Chair Collective, everyone. It's always close friends. So please reach out anytime. And thanks for having me on.
To the end of the episode, I think you deserve a thank you. Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast, wouldn't be anything without followers like you. I promise you that the production of these podcasts will continue to increase as the listeners increase and the followers increase. And so if you can do me a favor, if you found any value from this podcast episode, please give this a like, share, or subscribe to the show. It really helps us out. It keeps the word going and it helps our impressions. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Friday.